Right now, somewhere over central Israel, a ballistic missile is splitting apart in the night sky. Not exploding into one big blast, splitting, breaking into dozens of tiny, fast-moving bomblets that scatter across miles of city streets, apartment buildings, parks, and roads. The air defense system fires back. It shoots down the main missile body, but the bomblets, the dozens of small explosives already released at high altitude, they are already falling, and the interceptors cannot catch them all. This is not a scene from a war movie. This is not a hypothetical scenario being gamed out in a Pentagon simulation room. This is what has been happening over Israel, over Dubai, over Bahrain, and over U.S. military bases across the Gulf for 20 straight days. And right now, on day 20 of this war, the situation has entered a phase that most mainstream coverage is still not explaining clearly enough. So today, here on Unlocked History Hub, we are going to walk through exactly what is happening, why it matters far beyond the battlefield, and what the real consequences are for you, your family, and the entire world economy. Let's start with the weapon that is changing the math of this war. Iran has been firing ballistic missiles since day one of this conflict, which began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran. But something shifted as the weeks went on. According to Israeli military assessments and multiple verified reports, roughly half of all ballistic missiles Iran has fired at Israel in this conflict now carry cluster munitions instead of single conventional warheads. That is a significant tactical evolution. Here is why that matters so much. A traditional ballistic missile flies to its target and explodes. Your defense system fires an interceptor, hits the missile, and the threat is eliminated. One missile in, one interceptor out. The math is manageable. But a cluster warhead changes that equation completely. Iran's cluster-equipped missiles, including the Khorramshahr variant, which can carry up to 80 separate bomblets, fly toward their target and then open up at high altitude. The bomblets, each carrying several pounds of explosives, scatter across an area that can span 7 to 8 miles. Now, instead of one threat, your defense system is facing dozens of fast-moving, small, low-signature objects falling across a massive area simultaneously. Israel's Arrow system can try to intercept the missile before the warhead opens. But if the interception is not a direct hit, the bomblets release anyway. And once released, they fall to the Iron Dome's range, which was designed for short-range rockets, not for tracking and shooting down dozens of tiny dispersed objects at once. The result is a defense system being asked to do something it was never fully designed to do. And the financial cost is staggering. Every interceptor Israel fires costs millions of dollars. Iran's cluster munitions cost a fraction of that. Iran is spending cheap to force America and Israel to spend expensive on every single wave. Now here is where the interceptor supply question becomes genuinely alarming. As of this week, Israeli military officials acknowledged something striking. There are times, they said, when the Israeli Air Force deliberately chooses not to shoot down all of the cluster bomblets from an incoming Iranian missile. Let that sink in. The IAF is consciously allowing some of the small explosive fragments to fall rather than burning through their short-range interceptor stockpile. The reasoning is that cluster bomblets, while dangerous, are unlikely to penetrate reinforced bomb shelters, and so the risk calculation sometimes favors saving the interceptors for more critical threats. But think about what that decision reveals. It reveals that the interceptor stockpile is finite. It reveals that the defense system is already making triage decisions about which threats to engage and which ones to let through. And it reveals that if this conflict continues at its current tempo, the gap between incoming threats and available defenses will continue to widen. In my view, this is the single most underreported strategic reality of this entire war. The side with unlimited patience and a production line of cheap cluster munitions is slowly grinding down the side that depends on expensive limited interceptors. And that grinding process does not make headlines the way a single massive explosion does, but it is arguably more dangerous in the long run. Now, if you are finding this breakdown valuable, this is the moment where I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Here on Unlocked History Hub, we go beyond the headlines and give you the context that actually helps you understand what is happening in the world. Hitting like also helps this analysis reach more people who need to see it. Now let's keep going, because the military picture is only one part of this story. By day 20, Iran has launched over 350 ballistic missiles at Israel alone, and that is not counting the thousands of drones and cruise missiles fired across the wider Gulf region. The UAE has reported receiving over 314 ballistic missiles, 1,672 drones, and 15 cruise missiles since this conflict began. Dubai International Airport was struck. Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, has had to intercept 125 missiles and 211 drones. Qatar's LNG export facilities were hit by a drone attack on March 2nd, and Qatar Energy temporarily suspended production. A major oil refinery operated by ADNOC in Abu Dhabi was struck, forcing a shutdown of a facility that normally produces over 900,000 barrels of oil per day. These are not random strikes. This is a coordinated, sustained campaign designed to do something very specific. Iran, unable to match American and Israeli air power directly, is internalizing a simple strategic logic. Raise the cost of this war for everyone. Make the pain so wide and so deep that the pressure for de-escalation builds faster than the will to continue fighting. And here is where I want to share my honest perspective. That strategy appears to be working economically, even if it has not yet changed the military trajectory. The International Energy Agency has described this conflict as producing the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That is not a dramatic phrase chosen for impact. That is the official assessment of the body that tracks global energy flows. Before this war, roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day moved through the Strait of Hormuz. That flow has now slowed to a trickle. Brent crude has surged above $100 per barrel, up from around $65 before the conflict began. Gasoline prices in California crossed $6.50 per gallon as of March 12th. The national average in the U.S. crossed $4 per gallon, the highest since late 2023. And the first week of this war alone reportedly cost U.S. taxpayers over $11 billion in military operations, not counting the enormous buildup of forces in the region that preceded the strikes. For American families, this is not an abstract geopolitical event. It is showing up at the gas pump, in grocery store aisles, and in utility bills. Economists at the Pacific Research Institute have said the war is putting upward pressure on the prices of gasoline, electricity, and groceries through higher transportation, packaging, and fertilizer costs. Fertilizer shipments pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Chemical feedstocks used to make electronics, semiconductors, and plastics pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Food and produce cargo, pharmaceutical exports, battery components, all of it moves through that narrow waterway. Closing it, even partially, does not just raise oil prices. It sends a chain reaction of cost increases through virtually every product in the global supply chain. And that chain reaction hits Americans who are already dealing with inflation that was elevated before a single bomb was dropped. The global damage extends far beyond the United States. In Asia, the situation is even more acute. Around 80% of Asia's oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Vietnam has oil reserves that last fewer than 20 days at normal consumption. Pakistan and Indonesia have about 20 days of reserves. India, Thailand, and the Philippines have about 2 months. South Korea, Japan, and China together account for nearly 70% of all oil that passes through the strait. Schools have been closed in parts of Asia. Governments are asking citizens to reduce fuel consumption. Central banks from Chile to Poland are abandoning plans to cut interest rates because oil-driven inflation is complicating their entire monetary policy framework. The World Economic Forum has put it plainly. This is not a regional crisis. It is a structural shock to the world economy, delivered at a moment of exceptional fragility. And the longer it continues, the more those temporary disruptions harden into lasting economic damage. Back on the military front, there is a development that deserves serious attention and careful thought. The killing of Ali Larijani on March 18th, confirmed by Israeli defense officials, represents more than just the elimination of a senior Iranian figure. Larijani was not simply a hardliner in the traditional sense. Within the specific context of Iranian politics, he was actually considered someone that Western governments believed could be negotiated with. Before this war began, both American and Israeli analysts reportedly viewed Larijani as a potential transition figure, someone who could eventually bring different Iranian factions together and represent a more pragmatic course. Now that individual is gone. In my assessment, and this is a perspective shared by conflict analysts who study political vacuums in authoritarian systems, every time you remove a rational actor from inside a hostile government, what fills that space is almost never more moderate. History shows this pattern without exception. The vacuum that follows the removal of a negotiable figure is filled by harder positions, more extreme factions, and less willingness to pursue diplomatic exits. That is not a justification for any particular position in this conflict. It is simply an honest reading of how these dynamics tend to unfold. There is also the matter of Russia's role in this conflict, which has received far less attention than it deserves. The Wall Street Journal confirmed what Iran had been stating publicly for weeks. Russia is providing improved drone technology to Iran. Russia is expanding intelligence sharing with Iranian forces. Russia is supplying satellite imagery that is being used operationally in this conflict. The pattern of Iranian targeting precision throughout this war, finding classified American aircraft positions, locating ammunition depot layouts, tracking high-value individuals under heavy security, is consistent with intelligence support from a party with significant satellite and signals capabilities. Russia has clear incentives here. Every week that American military attention is focused on the Persian Gulf is a week where pressure on Ukraine is reduced. Every dollar America spends on interceptors and munitions over the Gulf is a dollar not available for European defense commitments. And every barrel of Iranian-disrupted oil that cannot reach the market is a barrel where Russia's elevated oil revenues help refill its war chest. The geopolitical calculus for Moscow is straightforward. This conflict serves Russian interests even if Russia fires not a single shot. Meanwhile, the diplomatic picture heading into this conflict is something that weighs heavily on me when I think about what this war has cost. According to sources who spoke to The Guardian, British National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell attended the final rounds of U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations in Geneva in late February. He described Iran's proposal at that session as significant. He said real momentum was being built. He believed an agreement was within reach. The window was there, and then it closed. Whether that closure was inevitable, whether the intelligence about Iran's nuclear program made military action unavoidable, or whether diplomatic channels could have produced a resolution without a war that has now killed Americans, displaced hundreds of thousands across the region, and triggered the worst oil shock in recorded history, that is a question that historians will debate for decades. What I can say is that the costs of where we are now are real, they are large, and they are landing on ordinary people in the United States and around the world who had no vote and no voice in how this situation developed. The USS Gerald Ford, one of the primary American carriers in the region, had to dock in Greece on March 12th after a fire broke out on board. Sailors reported sleeping on floors with no change of clothes after their quarters were damaged. That is what a military stretched to its operational limits looks like from the inside. 13 American service members have been confirmed dead. 200 have been reported injured, many of them seriously. And the conflict continues to demand resources, interceptors, munitions, and lives at a rate that raises legitimate questions about sustainability. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joseph Kent, resigned and stated publicly that the United States was pulled into this war and that he viewed it as unlawful. Kent is a Gold Star husband whose wife was killed in a terrorist attack. He is as deeply committed to American security as anyone who has served in these positions. When someone with that background and that level of classified access resigns and calls the war unlawful 20 days in, that is not partisan politics. That is a signal worth taking seriously. As I look at all of this together, the cluster warhead evolution, the interceptor depletion concern, the economic shock spreading from the Gulf to grocery stores in Ohio and Indiana, the diplomatic track that was close before it was severed, the Russian support flowing to Iranian forces, the leadership vacuums created by targeted killings, and the intelligence official resignations from inside the administration itself, what I see is a conflict that has moved well beyond the clean narrative of a decisive operation achieving defined objectives. This war is now a complex, multi-layered crisis with cascading consequences that extend to every part of the global economy and every corner of geopolitical alignment. Brent crude above $100 per barrel is not a number that stays at the gas pump. It feeds into the cost of every product made, moved, or stored anywhere on Earth. Analysts at Capital Economics have warned that if the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed, Brent crude could reach $150 per barrel within 6 months. At that level, the word recession stops being a projection and starts being a description. The question of where this goes next is genuinely uncertain, and I want to be honest about that uncertainty rather than pretend there is a clear ending visible from here. There are 3 realistic directions this conflict could move. The first is a negotiated de-escalation, where back-channel communications produce a ceasefire framework and the strait gradually reopens. That is the path that would produce the fastest economic recovery, but it requires political will from parties who are currently in the middle of active combat operations. The second is a prolonged grinding conflict at reduced intensity, where the missile exchanges continue at a lower tempo, the strait remains partially blocked, and the world adapts to a new elevated baseline of energy costs and geopolitical tension. That scenario produces lasting economic damage that compounds over months. The third is further escalation, potentially involving the Iranian oil infrastructure on Karg Island, which handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Mike Waltz stated this week that President Trump is not taking any options off the table regarding Karg Island. If that infrastructure becomes a target, the oil disruption would move from severe to catastrophic on a global scale. I am not predicting that outcome. I am noting that it is being discussed openly at the highest levels of the U.S. government right now. What is clear to me is that this is not a moment where any of us can afford to watch passively and assume it will resolve itself without consequence for our daily lives. The price of energy, the cost of food, the stability of financial markets, and the direction of American foreign policy for the next generation are all being shaped by what happens in the next few weeks in the Persian Gulf and in the diplomatic corridors that lead away from this conflict. The cluster warheads over Israeli cities and the interceptor calculations being made in real time are not distant military abstractions. They are the visible edge of an economic and geopolitical transformation that is already touching your wallet and your world. And here on Unlocked History Hub, we are going to keep tracking every development as this story unfolds, because understanding the full picture is the most powerful thing any of us can do right now. If this breakdown gave you context you could not find anywhere else, I want you to do something right now. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think about this. Do you believe a diplomatic solution is still possible at this stage? Do you think the interceptor supply concern is being taken seriously enough by American leadership? Do you think the global economic consequences of this war are being communicated honestly to the American public? Your perspective genuinely matters, and every comment you leave helps this analysis reach more people who need to see it. Share this video with someone in your life who is trying to make sense of what is happening. Share it with your family, share it with your friends. An informed community is the most powerful thing we can build together. And if you are not yet subscribed to Unlocked History Hub, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next video in this series is going to go even deeper into where this conflict is heading and what it means for America's position in the world. We are just getting started.